This is the all-new MacBook Air M2, powered by the M2 chip and housed in a brand new design. But does that design lead to improved performance? The MacBook Air M2 base model includes an 8-core CPU, 8-core GPU, 8 GB of unified memory, and 256 GB of SSD storage. On the left is a brand new MagSafe charging port and 2 USB-C Thunderbolt ports. And on the right is a brand new high-impedance headphone jack. Also included is an updated FaceTime 1080p camera housed in a notch similar to that found in the MacBook Pro 14 and 16 inch. The quality is just slightly improved over the old 720p camera found in the MacBook Air M1, but it's decent for FaceTime and Zoom calls. And the keyboard also has the full height function keys found in the MacBook Pro 14 and 16 inch. In casual usage, the MacBook Air M2 base model is just as fast and snappy as the M1 model, if not faster. So we used it opening browsers, opening apps like News, Apple TV Plus, all that, and it just flies with everyday usage. You won't see any sort of slowdown. It's an overall very premium experience, and if you're using this for browsing and streaming, it is definitely fast, smooth, and snappy. The new 13.6-inch Retina display on the MacBook Air M2 is really good. It's 100 nits brighter than the previous M1 model and supports more than 1 billion colors as opposed to several million colors on the previous model. Now also, the image is a bit warmer than the prior M1 models, and overall the quality is still pretty good. The sound system is improved with a 4-speaker sound system that's hidden within the hinge, and it sounds really great. We tested out Final Cut Pro on the MacBook Air M2 base model, and overall the scrubbing moving through the timeline is really quick and snappy, even better than the M1 Pro model. But we wanted to test it further to compare it against the MacBook Pro M1 to see how the performance compared with the brand new M2 chip. Now in our test, we decided to export a 4K 60 FPS file into H.264 format to see which would render faster, the MacBook Air M2 or the MacBook Pro M1. The MacBook Pro M1 rendered the file at 6 minutes and 54 seconds, while the MacBook Air M2 rendered the file at 6 minutes and 45 seconds, which is impressive because it doesn't have active cooling. After that, we rendered the same file in ProRes 422 format to see which one would be faster. Now the results are a bit shocking. The MacBook Pro M1 exported this file in 4 minutes and 10 seconds, while the MacBook Air M2 exported the file at 7 minutes and 12 seconds. That is a 3-minute difference compared to the MacBook Pro M1. And what happened was when we were exporting back to back, the MacBook Air M2 throttled way back because it doesn't have active cooling in order to maintain a certain temperature. Now we exported the same file on the MacBook Air M2 off a cold boot that is not back-to-back exports, and it finished in 4 minutes and 26 seconds. So that is much more competitive to the MacBook Pro M1 and impressive because it doesn't have active cooling. So if you are under a sustained workload, this M2 chip will throttle back, but if you are just doing one export here and there, it'll perform fine. As you may have heard, the MacBook Air M2 includes a single 256GB SSD NAND chip, compared to the MacBook Air M1 and the MacBook Pro M1 base models, which include two 128GB SSD NAND chips. So we wanted to test this 10GB file transfer between the MacBook Air M2 base model and the MacBook Pro M1 base model. Now both these SSDs have a similar storage profile. They both have about 100GB available on each chip. Now the MacBook Pro M1 transferred this 10GB file in 17.68 seconds, while the MacBook Air M2 transferred the same file in 36.95 seconds. That is more than twice as long as the Pro M1, which uses a dual NAND chip setup compared to the Air M2's single NAND chip setup. Now one area where we saw a great improvement from the M2 over the M1 is its graphics power, and we ran a copy of CSGO off Steam, and it maintained an average of 60 FPS, which is great for this new notebook because it doesn't have a fan and it's not plugged in. So which Mac is right for you? Well, it's super confusing because the MacBook Air M2 base model starts at $1199, which is up to $300 more than the MacBook Air base model and up to $100 more than the old MacBook Pro M1, which we use. Now the MacBook Air M1 and the MacBook Pro M1 are great for everyday tasks. They have the better dual SSD NAND setup for faster transfer speeds, and they cost less than the MacBook Air M2. If you are a professional that needs a system for better sustained workflow, then we would recommend just jumping straight to the MacBook Pro 14 or 16 inch. Right now, these two models in the middle, the MacBook Air M2 and the MacBook Pro M2, are having really mixed performance issues because of the newer chip design, which can throttle faster, and the fact that they didn't include the dual NAND SSD setup in the two base models. So we'd recommend just blocking out the two middle options and sticking with the MacBook Air if you're a casual user, and a MacBook Pro 14 or 16 inch if you are a professional user. But if you like the new design with the new MagSafe charging, the updated FaceTime 1080p camera, and a better sound system, you will be paying for it with the new MacBook Air M2. In fact, all the money seems to be going more towards the design than the performance. So just keep that in mind before you make your purchase. It is still a very good computer for everyday use. It's just not where the value is at the moment. So for more news and reviews, head to news.punchjump.com.